Welcome to Alaska Statewide Weather. This is Eric Holloway for February 10th, 2020. If you have any other questions that you might want to research your weather for your certain area, we have a couple options for you. Our 1-800 number, 1-800-472-0391, or you can get on the web and reach us at the Weather Service at weather.gov/Alaska. If you take out Alaska and put in Fairbanks, or Anchorage, or Juneau, it'll further help you refine your search. Lastly, we do have a email address that you can reach us and ask any questions that you see here or any questions you have about the weather. Please don't hesitate to contact us. Moving on to the hazards weather, we have a winter weather advisory for the Northeast Brooks Range, and that includes Kaktovik and Prudhoe Bay area, with blowing and drifting snow, wind chills to 40 below and until noon Tuesday. Otherwise, we also have winter wind chill advisories out for the eastern Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Sea coast for -25 to -40 wind chills and that goes out until noon Tuesday. Lastly, over here in southeast Alaska, you see this little spot right here. We have winter storm warning out until this evening, 9 p.m. this evening, for additional 4 to 6 inches there. Looking at the satellite, you'll see that cloud shield associated with the frontal band. We'll be showing you here shortly, but lots of clouds and precipitation. Juneau's back to getting some snow right now. We also had a little bit of snow in the farther north as Yakutat, but otherwise a nice cloud shield out ahead of that next system. Otherwise, a higher pressure remains over much of the interior and pretty decent conditions across much of the rest of the southwest and portions of south central. There's that next low near Shemya with associated clouds with that system moving through St. Paul. We'll set this in motion. You can see that mixed precipitation's slowly moving eastward associated with that low. We had mixed precipitation, even some rain showers through Unalaska reported today. And we'll take a look at what's going on in the southeast. Again, they had some rain showers here earlier and most likely snow showers on the coastal mountains and further inland across British Columbia and portions of the southern Yukon Territory. For today's weather, there's that 968 millibar low with a occluded front spreading out through the central Bering. Nice cloud shield out ahead of that with mixed precipitation out ahead of that. We also had snow showers in the lower Noatak and Kobuk Valley and even spreading out to the northwest coast. And if we switch over here, you can see that low pressure system there with rain reported in portions of southeast Alaska. We also had some snow showers further inland with that 1004 millibar low. We also had analyzed that big high, a 1033 millibar high in the southwest portion of the state. Tonight's weather, that low fills to 965 millibar low and an occluded front becoming more stationary for tonight, and then again, mixed precipitation out ahead of that system, even rain and snow down there in eastern Aleutians and portions of the the extreme western end of the Alaska Peninsula. Clouds associated with that system out through much of the southwest, otherwise clearing through the interior, much of the mainland, even in south central with that 1036 millibar high. And that low pressure system will most likely become a stationary front with some mixed precipitation and rainfall, snow showers as you move further inland across Canada with that system. For Tuesday's weather, we're going to be looking at that low continuing to fill, 973 millibars now, and another low developing on that southern flank of that frontal band, 996 millibar low with mixed precipitation across portions of Kodiak Island, Alaska Peninsula, rain showers moving into the Gulf. Clouds across much of southwest, and what's going on in southeast. Looks like they're going to be clearing out on Tuesday with weakening stationary front there. Otherwise, blowing snow across the north slope and a 1038 millibar high. For Wednesday's weather, a 985 millibar low moves into the northern Gulf. Mixed precipitation, even snow showers across Copper River Basin, and rain moving into the northeast Gulf Coast and portions of the lower elevations of the Panhandle. And then we have another low, 976 millibar low, approaching the central Aleutians. For lows, Tuesday morning, we'll be looking at minus teens, minus 20s, even a minus 30 there. UAFTV, minus 28. Point Hope, minus 21. Kotzebue, minus 28. And then Fort Yukon, minus 30. Looks like Bettle might be the cold spot, minus 41. Otherwise, down through the southwest, minus teens and even single digits as we cool down again. Minus 5 in Anchorage, minus 1 there in Kenai, Soldotna. 22 at Kodiak, and teens and single digits there in the Bristol Bay region. Otherwise, 20s and 30s across the Aleutians. And we have 30s across a large portion of the southeast. Haines 26, Haines Skagway 26, 28, and then Yakutat 27. For Tuesday afternoon, things don't warm up a whole lot across the Arctic coast there. Minus teens, minus 20s, and even minus 30, with UAFTV minus 22, Kotzebue minus 26, Bettles minus 32. They might be in competition with AKwx Pass for the coldest reading on Tuesday afternoon. But otherwise, Fairbanks minus 20, single digits around 0 there in the southwest. Teens into south central and southwest Bristol Bay region. 20s and even a 40 there as you move into the eastern Aleutians. 31 at Kodiak, and 30s across the Panhandle and Yakutat. And for low temperatures Wednesday morning, we're going to be looking at minus 20s and 30s that continue across the north slope and Arctic coast. Otherwise, minus 45 there. Looks like it's going to be this cold spot at Arctic Village. Minus 38 at Fort Yukon, Kotzebue minus 32, Point Hope minus 32. And then let's see, what do we got? Minus 20s, even readings near minus single digits there in the southwest, and positive readings there in Bristol Bay region. Otherwise, south central in the teens, even 23 there at Cordova, and 30s across much of the Panhandle, 28 in Haines, 29 in Yakutat. Thank you for joining Alaska Weather. Stay tuned for the educational piece.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to the aviation forecast, looking at the flying weather for Tuesday morning, you can see that IFR conditions there in the eastern Aleutians, with marginal conditions there in the portions of Alaska Peninsula. Otherwise, pretty isolated to even scattered conditions across much of the mainland and even in the southeast, with marginal conditions there along the coastal mountains and very isolated conditions across the north slope. We will be tracking this low pressure system and associated frontal band across Aleutians and into the Gulf here next 2 days, with IFR conditions across the Alaska Peninsula and into portions of the eastern Aleutians. And that spreads out into the Bering, but otherwise marginal conditions begin to show up there Tuesday afternoon in the Panhandle. And things get a little bit worse with ceiling visibilities coming down a little bit across the Panhandle, with marginal conditions into there and across the Northeast Gulf and spreading out through South Central. IFR conditions through much of the southwest and portions of the eastern Kenai and Kodiak Island. Otherwise, isolated to scattered IFR conditions down through the eastern Aleutians. And that low pressure system finally makes it into the Gulf. Low pressure, or a warm front, cold fronts frontal band situation bringing IFR conditions across southeast and into the northern Gulf, even IFR conditions there in the Copper River Basin down through the eastern Kenai and portions of Kodiak Island. Otherwise, generally improving conditions across the southwest with marginal conditions there. Likely another low pressure system moving into the western Aleutians there, marginal conditions along the north slope. It's a good day to be a pilot on Tuesday with VFR conditions nearly statewide, Adigan, VFR, Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR, rainy VFR, windy VFR, Isabel VFR, Mentasta VFR, and Tanita VFR, Portage even VFR, and even the passes in southeast Alaska VFR conditions. Looking at the freezing levels, we can see some elevated freezing levels there in the Gulf of Alaska with 2,000 to 4,000 feet showing up in the southern part of the Panhandle. Otherwise, the surface freezing level crosses the the southeast Panhandle into the northern Gulf and down through the Gulf of Alaska and out through the Alaska Peninsula into the Bering Sea. For ice conditions, I went with a strong southerly fetch of moisture. I went between 2,000 and 7,000 feet over portions of the Panhandle and even into southwest and the Pribs and St. Lawrence Island, but otherwise considerable moderate in portions of the Alaska Peninsula. For the jet stream, 185 knots there just south of the Aleutians, 60 knots as you get into the southwest part of Alaska, speeding up to 100 knots as you get down into the British Columbia area around that low pressure system there in the lower 48. But otherwise, generally not all that impressive conditions as far as the jet stream, 30 knots there just off the Arctic coast on Tuesday. For 9,000 foot winds on Tuesday, looking at a southerly fetch across the state with 15 to 40 knots, even 15 knots there across the Brooks Range, around that high pressure ridge, looking at just 20 knots there coming on the coast of the northwest there. Otherwise, Panhandle, 25 to 40 knots there, and around that low pressure system, strong westerly winds across the Aleutians with 30 to 40 knots there. For 3,000 foot winds on Tuesday, we're looking at again that ridge. Weak conditions around that ridge there, 5 to 10 knots across much of the mainland. More northerly conditions across the Panhandle, 5 to 10 knots there. That low pressure system near the Alaska Peninsula driving southerly winds 20 to 30 knots through, and even 40 knots through the Gulf of Alaska. Otherwise, again, westerly winds across the Aleutians around that low out there in the western part of the Aleutians. For turbulence, below 4,000 feet there in the southern part of the Panhandle and below 4,000 feet in Kodiak Island and portions of the northern Alaska Peninsula. Otherwise, Aleutians below 2,000 feet there. Otherwise, generally mild conditions for flying turbulence-wise across much of the state. We'll be back with the marine forecast here shortly.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and today I'm privileged to introduce Dr. Uccellini, the Director of the United States National Weather Service. Welcome back to Alaska, sir.
Thank you, Dave. Glad to be here.
Thanks. Prior to being the leader of the National Weather Service, your work included an extensive look at snowstorms across the northeastern United States. These are the types of storms that can bring some of the country's largest cities to its knees. Tell me a little bit about your fascination with snow.
Well, as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in weather, growing up as a kid on Long Island, New York, and was particularly fascinated by snowstorms, why they occurred. The distribution of snow was very varied across the entire region. The rain-snow line, all those things fascinated me right from the get-go. And I was interested in knowing how they worked, how the forecast worked, or more often than not, didn't work one way or the other. And that drove me, that interest continued to build and drove me through high school right into college, wanting to be a meteorologist.
Okay, that's a fascinating story, and I think every meteorologist has a weather story like that in some way.
Right.
Due to Alaska's size and proximity to the North Pole, sometimes it's difficult to detect and analyze the weather patterns over Alaska. What's the National Weather Service doing to improve that weather detection?
Well, observations in this type of environment is a big challenge, whether it's from space or from what we call in situ observations from the ground or within the systems. Clearly, satellites have been playing an increasing role in providing the big picture, not only from a visual sense and what you see is occurring, but also from providing the data for numerical models that then are used to actually predict the weather. Alaska is actually pretty well positioned with respect to polar orbiting satellites, since you get a faster return of those satellites over your particular area. And in fact, the polar satellite system is the backbone for the observations that we use in our models, especially our global models, and they're particularly important for observing weather features that affect Alaska.
Alaskans live and die by the weather every day, and one of the strategic goals of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service is to develop a more weather-ready nation. What does it mean for Alaskans to be weather-ready?
Well, the strategic outcome is based on people being ready, responsive, and therefore resilient to the increasing threats to extreme weather events. Those threats are related to not only the nature of the events, but the fact that we're becoming more vulnerable to them as we have more people, more infrastructure that could be affected by these events. So we have to ensure that the observations we make for situational awareness, the forecasts we make for people to take the proper responses, are connected to people's actions, the response to these events, so that they will be more resilient to what's facing them. There are examples with respect to hurricanes. More people living along the coastline takes longer to evacuate. We have to make better forecasts with longer lead times, but we also have to communicate the threat so people will actually take action to avoid those storms. Up here you have, as in other parts of the United States, an increasing threat related to fire. As there are more people living in fire-prone areas, we have to ensure that our forecasts are good, that we don't have false alarms that make people not react to the forecast when in fact they should. But we also have to be able to communicate the threat and make sure that we're working with the partners in the emergency management community so that communities and right down to individuals will actually take the proper responses in the face of these events. So that's the strategic goal. There are a lot of challenges for us in terms of improving forecasts, but also improving our communication skills and linking with the emergency management communities that are actually out there trying to protect lives and mitigate property loss.
So a huge partnership effort going forward.
That's one of the important keys for the success of meeting the strategic goal.
Okay. Well, one of the things you're talking about was understanding the weather information we're getting back from the computers, weather modeling, and you did a lot of work with that in some of your prior positions with the Environmental Prediction Center there, the National Center for Environmental Prediction. What can you tell us about recent improvements in that weather modeling? And you were using the polar orbiters as kind of a source of information that started that process.
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that everything you see, you read and hear about weather, climate, or ocean forecasts are all driven by numerical models. Now, it really has been the revolution in our forecast process in the last part of the 20th century. The success of that numerical enterprise is based on three factors: big computers, global data, not just local data, but you have to have a global data set, and then the models themselves, the science that's behind the models and in running the models in an operational mode. So we're working to improve all three of those components. We upgraded our computers last year. We're going through another upgrade even as I speak. We'll be upgrading from 200 trillion calculations per second to 700 trillion calculations per second by January of 2015. This increase in the computer will allow us to run what we call Earth system models. It's not just the atmosphere, it's the atmosphere, ocean, ice, which is obviously very important up here, and land models that are all coupled together at higher resolution. So you need the big computers, you need the science that allows us to run these models and run them in a parallel mode, and that they're coupled so that the ocean effects could affect the atmosphere and vice versa, as an example. And then the global observations are absolutely critical, and over the last 20, 30 years they've become more dependent upon the satellite systems, and especially the polar orbiting satellites, which help drive the observations needed for those models, whether they be atmospheric observations, land, ice observations. We're deriving more and more of that from satellites now that feed into these models and produce forecasts with extended lead times. Now out, for extreme events especially, we're seeing much improved forecast out in the 4, 5, 6, 7, and even 8-day range, which gets us back to Weather Ready Nation, because if you're going to get ready for a storm event, you want those consistent forecasts approaching that event from day 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, so you can take the actions several days in advance that can help mitigate the property loss and protect your livelihood.
Okay, all part of the mission of protecting life and property. Dr. Uccellini, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and speaking to Alaskans and sharing how the National Weather Service is working for Alaska and the nation. Wish you safe travels around the 49th. Enjoy your time here, sir. And for Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back to the Marine Forecast. Let's take a look at the sea ice analysis today. You can see we have an opening there with lower concentration of ice there in Bristol Bay. We do expect some of this pack ice to slowly drift westward with the low pressure system and frontal band moving into the Bering Sea. Otherwise, Cook Inlet remains pretty much status quo with ice filling in there. We do expect maybe a little bit of growth with the colder temperatures moving back into the region. For Tuesday's marine forecast for southeast, looks like winds are going to be generally either northerly over the Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage out of the north at 15 to 30. Otherwise, from the east at 15 at the southern end of the inside waters. Outside waters looks like they're going to be generally from the west 15 to 20, more easterly across the northern part of the Gulf there. For southeast on Wednesday, winds generally from the south 20 to 30 knots there across the southern and central portions of the inside waters, more northerly out of the Lynn Canal, up to 15 knots there. Otherwise, outside waters, winds generally from the south 35 to 40 with seas as high as 16 feet as you get into the northern Gulf. For Tuesday's south central marine forecast, winds northerly across the northern Gulf and Prince William Sound, 15 knots. Otherwise, from the east at 20 knots, seas as high as 8 feet. Down the Cook Inlet, 10 to 30 knots. And northern and central, even northerly down there, Kamishak Bay, seas as high as 12 feet there. For south central Wednesday, looking at North Gulf, looking at winds generally from the southeast, 45 knots, seas as high as 15. Prince William Sound, northeasterly 25 knots. Otherwise, from the northeast across the rest of the Gulf, with winds as high as 40 knots there, seas as high as 14 knots, or 14 feet, I'm sorry. And across the Cook Inlet, looking at winds generally from the northeast, 25 to 40, northern and central, even northerly 45 knots with seas as high as 20 feet in Kamishak Bay. For Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, winds around Kodiak Island generally from the northeast or east, 30 to 35 knots, seas as high as 13 feet. South side of Alaska Peninsula, east, 30 knots, seas as high as 16 feet. Otherwise, on the north side of that, winds generally from the north or east, 30 knots. For Wednesday, around Kodiak Island, winds generally from the north or northwest, 35 knots, seas as high as 22 feet there. Winds switching around from the west at 40 knots. Otherwise, westerly on the south side of the Alaska Peninsula, 45 knots, seas as high as 22 feet. And across the northern part of north side of the Alaska Peninsula, winds generally from the northwest at 25 knots, seas as high as 12 feet as you get on the other side of the pack ice there. For the Aleutian chain, looking at winds generally from the north, or from the south at 30 to 35 knots, seas as high as 21 feet near just south of Nikolsky. Otherwise, winds generally from the south or southwest, 30 to 35 knots, seas as high as 23 feet out there near Shimia. For the Aleutian chain on Wednesday, winds generally from the west or south as you move into the central portions of the Aleutians, otherwise southeasterly as you get out towards the western portions of the Aleutians, 45 knots there, 30 knots as you get towards Shimia, seas as high as 21 feet there. And for the west coast, Tuesday, looking at winds generally offshore from the east, 20 in Norton Sound, otherwise 30 knots across the rest of the region near the edge of the pack ice, winds generally from the east at 30, 35 knots, seas as high as 15, 16 feet. Otherwise, Wednesday, looking at winds generally from the northeast at 20 to 25 knots, and more westerly as you get on the south side of the, near Pribs, on the south side of the pack ice, winds from the west at 30. From the Arctic coast, winds generally from the west, 15 to 25 knots there. Otherwise, down through the northwest and Bering Strait, winds generally from the east, offshore, near Seward Peninsula, 15 to 30. Otherwise, southerly from 15 knots on the northwest coast. And for Wednesday, winds generally from the north or west there, just off the Arctic coast. Otherwise, down through the northwest and Bering Strait, 5 to 20 knots there, generally out of the north. Tonight's weather looks like a low pressure system there in the Aleutians with a 965 millibar low.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.